I believe that this panel, the last of the summit, constitutes something like the 36th through 39th speakers. So some might say they saved the best for last. What I would do I would like to introduce the speakers very briefly one at a time and let each one have her or his due. If we have time, we'll have some questions. Then I will try to offer a very brief conspectus of the summit by way of what I believe are 3 important questions we should come away with based on the remarks we've heard. And then we shall adjourn to a reception and the handing off ceremony. So very briefly, not to give her due at all, but Karen Keninger is director of the National Library Service for the Blind and Physically Handicapped. She holds the highest position in the land for handicapped service. No wonder then that she's the current president of the National Council of State Agencies for the Blind, and she's the past chair for 6 years of the Consortium of User Libraries. She is truly one of the world leaders in her field, and we are very privileged to hear from her this afternoon. Karen.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I do want to acknowledge my colleague, Mark Lehman, who is in the back there running the PowerPoint for me, so that I don't have to mess with that. Thank you, Mark. This afternoon, yesterday and today, we've been talking about books. And last night we saw some beautiful examples of rare books, and we heard about Thomas Jefferson's collection. And a book truly can be a beautiful thing. Something that you want to touch, something you want to have the smell of and the feel of in your hands, something that has beautiful illustrations to capture your eye and your imagination. And then, of course, there's the words in there. I personally once had an opportunity to hold in my hands a 500-year-old book. They wouldn't let me touch anything last night, but I did, and it was an amazing experience to me because the book was kind of ratty. It had been around. It was not in the United States. I'll point that out. They would never let me do that here. But where I was, which was not here, they just said, oh, here's one. You can look at this. And I did. And it was old and well-worn. But the thing that was remarkable to me was the fact that someone from 500 years ago had written that book, and it was here to talk to me today, if I could only read it. But it was amazing that that container of that old raggedy book contained the words and the voice of somebody that lived so far long ago. Books as physical objects, we line our walls with them, we trade them, we share them, we hand them to our cousins and our sisters, and we say, oh, I read this fantastic book, here, you've got to read this. Or we study them, and we treasure them. Beautiful, handy, functional, well-loved containers, but containers nonetheless. The real treasure, as we've heard before, is not the binding, it's not the gold leaf, it's not the vellum, it's not even the ink on the pages, it's the words. It's the meeting of minds that a book can entail, the transfer of information, the sharing of ideas, the exploration of possibilities, the cultural imperatives, and the good old-fashioned stories contained in books. That's what makes them truly valuable. As a work of art, it has value in itself as an object, but really, it's the ability to read it, to study it, to evaluate it, and then to add to the world's dialogue. That's what matters. And the creative work contained in a book is the key to that sharing. As a container, its content has worked for most people for a very long time. But for some of us, a book like this one is one of the most frustrating aggravating objects in the world. Why is that? It's because it's tantalizing. There are voices inside this book I want to hear. There are stories that I want to know. There are perspectives that I want to understand. But I can't access this container. I cannot access the voices within. Now, I'm not the first person who's had this problem, and I won't be the last. I'm sure that you have picked up a book in a language that you didn't understand and wondered, wow, if I could only read Chinese, or if I could only read something, Sanskrit or whatever I can't read, I could unlock the treasures in this book. Louis Braille undoubtedly had this same experience. He wanted to know, but he was blind in France 200 years ago, and he couldn't read. Still, he wanted to experience the literature of his people. He wanted to share in that dialogue that Dr. Billington talked about. He wanted to be part of the world, and he had things to say. They say that necessity is the mother of invention, and it was necessity, not just a wish, not a desire, not a passing fancy. It was an imperative, a necessity that led him to create a reading and writing system that he, as a blind person, could use as fluently, as independently, and as readily as you use papers and pens. Louis Braille wanted to participate in the dialogue. He had things to say. He had a perspective on life that was unique to himself, and he wanted to know about other people's thoughts and ideas and experiences. He refused to accept what others thought was a simple fact that a blind person couldn't read. He heard about a night writing system developed by the military, and he took that idea and he refined it to create the reading and writing system that we know by his name today, which is Braille. Braille has a one-to-one equivalency with print. There's an A, a B, a C, a period, a question mark, a parenthesis, whatever. So when I read Braille, I am not reading a foreign language. I am not reading some obtuse and obscure thing. I'm just reading English in a font that my fingers can recognize. Now, a Braille book is not a particularly beautiful thing in itself. I've never seen a beautiful Braille book. Its covers are bare, and there's no photos, there's no fancy writing, no creative art. And it's bulky, and it's kind of big, and it's not really all that handy, but it is a book in the critical sense of the word. It contains the words of the author, and thus the thoughts, the ideas, the messages, the viewpoints of the person who wrote it. And I can sit down with that book and have that one-on-one dialogue with that author, whether they are Shakespeare or Homer or that James person. My container is different, but the content is the same. And I've been reading books like in Braille since I was 7, and I've had the same excitement and the same joy and the same vistas of possibility that my sighted sisters had. But the numbers of books in Braille are limited. It's expensive. It's a niche market. There's not very many people that produce them. The National Library Service for the Blind produces about 500 of them a year, which, as we just heard, is not very much compared to 3 million. Blind people want to read whatever's out there, not just the book that someone else picked, but any book, every book. So enter a pair of visionaries, Kenneth Jernigan and Ray Kurzweil. Jernigan is blind, but he wanted to read print books. He wanted to read everything that everybody else had access to. Ray Kurzweil is sighted, but he knew a whole lot about computers, and he had an idea that he thought would solve Jernigan's problem. So he combined what he knew about computers and cameras and all of that, and he created the first ebook system. He used optical character recognition to scan the book into the computer and then a synthesized voice system to read it back out. It was a big